A racist chef refuses to cook for a prominent figure, humiliating a black sous chef in front of the entire staff. But what happens the next day turns everything upside down. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching us from. The evening sun spilled golden light through the stained glass windows of Caraway Manor, casting soft patterns onto the polished oak floors. The air carried the faint aroma of thyme and roasted meat, a scent synonymous with the restaurant's reputation for elegance and exclusivity. It wasn't just the menu that drew in the city's elite. It was the ambience, a sense of history and refinement carefully preserved in every detail, from the hand-carved chairs to the framed photographs of distinguished guests that lined the walls. In the center of it all stood Christopher Walsh, the executive chef and undisputed ruler of the kitchen. His crisp white jacket, embroidered with his name in gold thread, fit him like a coat of armor. His eyes scanned the dining room with the precision of a hawk, catching even the smallest imperfections: a crooked table setting, a fingerprint on a wine glass, or a server moving too slowly. Nothing escaped his notice, and everyone knew it. Christopher had built Caraway Manor into what it was today. He'd inherited it from his father, a man whose old-world values shaped both the restaurant and Christopher himself. Tradition wasn't just a word to him, it was a law. The clientele reflected that, predominantly older, white, and wealthy. Over the years, Christopher had cultivated an environment where certain standards were expected, both in the kitchen and the dining room. Those standards left no room for what Christopher dismissed as modern trends: diversity hires, fusion cuisine, or social activism disguised as fine dining. The staff moved around him in controlled chaos, each one trained to operate like a cog in a well-oiled machine. The younger staff members, especially, were careful not to cross him. Christopher's temper was as famous as his risotto, and he had no patience for mistakes. Among them was Elijah Harper, the lowest-ranking member of the kitchen team. Elijah kept his head down, scrubbing pots and prepping vegetables with practiced efficiency. He was young, only 24, but carried himself with a quiet determination that sometimes made the older staff uneasy. His presence in the kitchen was an anomaly. He was the only black employee in the restaurant, and everyone knew it. Elijah had learned to ignore the comments, the sideways glances, and the jokes whispered just loud enough for him to hear. He wasn't here to make friends. He was here to learn. The tattered notebook tucked in his apron pocket was filled with recipes his grandmother had taught him, dishes rooted in family history and tradition. On his lunch breaks, he'd sit in the alley behind the restaurant, flipping through the pages and dreaming about the restaurant he might own one day. But dreams felt far away at Caraway Manor, especially under Christopher's watchful eye. That evening, as the dinner rush began, Christopher moved through the kitchen barking orders and tasting sauces. Elijah worked silently, dicing carrots into uniform cubes, when the owner of the restaurant, Harold Sinclair, appeared in the doorway. Harold, in his late 60s, wore a tailored suit and polished shoes that sharply contrasted with the chaos of the kitchen. The staff fell silent as he stepped inside. "Christopher," Harold said, nodding toward the office. "A word." Christopher wiped his hands on a towel and followed him, leaving the rest of the kitchen frozen in anticipation. Elijah exchanged a glance with Miriam, one of the line cooks, but neither spoke. Inside the office, Harold's voice was low but firm. Christopher listened, arms crossed, his expression darkening with every word. When he emerged a few minutes later, his face was flushed, and his jaw was tight. He clapped his hands sharply, snapping the staff back to work. "Focus," he barked. "We're not running a cafeteria here." But the tension lingered, spreading through the kitchen like smoke. By the time service began winding down, the whispers had started. Miriam leaned toward Elijah as they scrubbed the counters. "Did you hear what that was about?" she asked. Elijah shook his head, but the knot in his stomach told him it wasn't good. "The former president is coming," Miriam said. "Obama?" Elijah froze, his hands tightening around the dish towel. Miriam nodded. "Whole private party. Just confirmed it." Elijah's thoughts raced. Barack Obama, one of the most influential black men in history, was coming here, to Caraway Manor. It felt surreal. For the first time in months, Elijah felt a flicker of excitement, as if this could be his chance to prove himself. But when he looked at Christopher pacing near the prep station, his stomach sank. The look on the chef's face wasn't excitement, it was disgust. The next morning, Christopher's mood hadn't improved. He summoned the entire staff before the lunch shift, his voice sharp as he addressed them. "We have a situation," he said. "Tomorrow night, we're hosting a private dinner for Barack Obama and his entourage." Murmurs rippled through the group. "I don't want any mistakes," Christopher continued, his eyes locking on Elijah. "And let me make something clear. This is still my kitchen. We're doing things my way. No exceptions." Elijah clenched his jaw but said nothing. "Seating arrangements," Christopher went on. "I want them in the back, away from the windows, away from the regulars. I don't care who he is. He's not going to disrupt the flow of this restaurant." The murmur turned into stunned silence. Even Miriam looked uneasy. "Problem?" Christopher snapped. No one answered. "Good," he said. "Then let's get to work." The kitchen exploded into motion, but Elijah's mind wouldn't stop spinning. He thought about the notebook in his apron, about the recipes he'd written down, and about the stories his grandmother had told him, stories of struggle and survival, of kitchens that were more than just places to cook food. For the first time since starting at Caraway Manor, Elijah felt something stir inside him. He didn't know what it was yet: anger, determination, hope, but it burned hot and steady. And as Christopher barked orders and the staff scrambled to obey, Elijah made a silent promise to himself. Whatever happened tomorrow night, he wouldn't let it break him. The morning of the dinner arrived heavy with expectation. Inside the kitchen of Caraway Manor, the air felt tighter than usual. The sharp clang of knives against cutting boards and the hiss of searing pans filled the space. Yet it wasn't enough to drown out the underlying tension. Conversations were shorter, movements sharper. The staff had worked under pressure before, but this felt different. This wasn't just a dinner service, it was a test, and everyone knew it. Christopher Walsh stood at the center of the kitchen, his sleeves rolled up and his hands planted firmly on the prep table. The early deliveries had already arrived. Crates of vegetables and spices lined up by the back door. But his eyes lingered on the clipboard in his hands. It detailed the menu for the evening, each course meticulously planned. Yet Christopher looked at it as though the paper itself offended him. "This is my kitchen," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the clatter. The staff froze, their eyes flickering toward him. "I don't care who's sitting out there tonight," he continued. "They eat what I cook, the way I cook it. No special requests, no exceptions." His gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Elijah, who stood at the far end of the counter chopping parsley. Elijah didn't look up, but he felt the weight of Christopher's stare, sharp as a knife. "And if anyone can't handle that," Christopher added, his voice lowering, "you know where the door is." The message was clear. No one moved. Elijah's knife kept moving, each chop steady and precise, but his heart pounded in his chest.